I remember the night the house burned. Chains rattled outside like a chorus of the damned as smoke swallowed the chandeliers. The overseer's shout turned into a wet, choking silence. His body lay where he had fallen. Elise's silk caught flame, folding like a pale, burning petal. I stood in the doorway, ash on my skin, and they called me what I had been all my life, a slave. But that night, the name I carried changed everything, and what I did next stunned them all. I was born at Caldwell, beneath a roof that never belonged to me. The plantation sat on a stretch of Mississippi earth where the sun bent itself into glare, and the cotton fields rolled like a sea of white against the cruel sky. Master Thomas Caldwell owned not just acres, but people. Names were traded for ledgers, faces reduced to numbers. My first memory is the taste of dirt and the crack of a lash. My second is of my mother whispering my given name like a prayer before she was sold south. I learned quickly that names could be taken and returned like blankets in winter. Master Caldwell was a man whose voice meant law. He wore his wealth like armor and his temper like a second coat. Mistress Margaret kept her face smooth and cold, the kind of woman who could slice a person with a look. Brant, the overseer, kept the fields in concert with his whip and a grin I learned to hate. And Elise was both indulgence and cruelty wrapped in a woman's body. She was large, pale, a child of excess with a laugh that frightened the others. Her hands never saw work. Her fingers only touched silver and satin. She moved through the house like a small monarch, and where she passed the servants shrank away. I was 19 when he gave me to her. Not as a husband, not as a companion, but as property in a display that made the household laugh. "He's yours," Master Caldwell said that day, as if he were handing her a trinket. Elise clapped her hands and named me Sammy, the way one names a dog. The first task she set, to dress her, to fetch her water, to do the things a pampered girl could not be bothered with, felt like a crown of thorns placed on a proud man's head. The others watched me carry it like a public joke. From that day forward, my work changed from the fields to the corridors of the house. I learned the opening and shutting of heavy shutters, the weight of heavy curtains, the cadence of servants' steps in the night. Elise treated me like an amusement. She would clap at my clumsy attempts to learn the words in her books and toss insults like crumbs. "Strong, but stupid," she would say with a smile that never reached her eyes. Brant watched this all with amusement. "Humor her," he would say. "She's your mistress now." The plantation life was rigid. Dawn, labor, supper, and the overseer's threats like a metronome. The holidays were the cruelest time. Christmas and New Year were when their wealth bared itself. The house glowed with candles, with feasts where the masters laughed, and we served like ghosts. We wore our fine coifs of silence. Our children watched in secret and learned not to be seen. There were quiet acts of mercy among us, an extra loaf hidden under a bundle, a whispered story in the dark. But mostly there was the daily work that aided bones and dreams. I learned the sound of the whip, the smell of burning coal, the place where a man could hide a hope. At night, I would lay on a thin pallet in a crowded cabin and map the house in my head. I counted the keys Brant wore, the number of guards outside the storeroom, the hours the master walked the grounds. I listened to the gossip that drifted back to the quarters, rumors of sales, of distant fires, of slave uprisings stamped out with hangings. The masters thought themselves secure because their money bought laws and silence. But in the hush of midnight, under the watch of a cowardly moon, I began to mark time not with days but with plans. What I learned, I kept in the hush of my own chest, like a coal ready to start a fire. What I intended next would make even the bravest men whisper. They say cruelty makes a man small. What cruelty did to me was different. It sharpened something inside until it cut me. Elise's treatment of me was less straightforward violence and more a slow, deliberate erasing. She would hum as she ordered me to hold mirrors so she could stare at herself, then laugh when I blinked, as if my human reaction were a joke. She'd have small parties where her friends pretended at intimacy and used me to fetch their wines. Once, she made a maid kneel on broken glass for misplacing a ribbon and called it a lesson. Brant cheered. The mistress pretended not to watch. I learned to be visible and not seen. Brant's violence, however, was pure and loud. He took delight in breaking men who still had dreams. I watched Isaac, who could sing, first have his voice cracked by a lash, and then his spirit sold a year later. I saw old Ruth, whose hands could sew faster than anyone, dragged behind the barn because she dared complain about a kettle left boiling. Those injuries did not fade in a night. They accumulated like rust on the bones of every man and woman here. The plantation's politics were a theater. The masters invited other planters to their feasts, men who wore similar cruelty in fine clothes. Around their tables they spoke of markets and property and the right to rule men. We, the people who fed their tables and salted their baths, stood behind them like shadows. Elise sat at the center of such tables and was indulged when she demanded things we did not have names for. She grew heavier, entitled, and more bored. Her cruelty became more precise. She experimented with small humiliations because the larger torments belonged to Brant and the master. I became a watcher and a learner. When the family left for church in town, the house fell into other hands, Brant's mostly, but a few servants slipped to their own corners. I noticed where the arsenic tins sat, how the master kept the keys to the storeroom clipped to his vest, who smoked where and when. Sometimes I would hear talk of nearby fires. A plantation's outbuilding had once burned down in a neighboring county. Rumor said it was a slave who had started it in desperation. The masters laughed at those tales. To them, such violence was a problem to be solved. To me, every story fed a furnace I could not yet ignite. Inside, my thoughts turned to small, precise revenge, not out of hatred that desired endless suffering, but out of an arithmetic that demanded balance. Every lash deserved an accounting. I carried my hurt like a ledger. I'd see Elise sliding across the parlor floor, her dress spilling like an insult, and I thought of how her body, the one that never felt the sting of labor, sat cushioned on money earned by pain. Once in a while, loneliness crept into her face, a hollow that made me think of mercy, and then, almost immediately, I saw the gleam in her eyes when she knew she could break someone without consequence. Still, others warned, "Samuel, don't go down that road." Ruth, Isaac before he died, they cautioned me of hangings, of burying alive as punishment for arson. They told me of men who had been hanged for less, of bodies swinging until crows pecked their cheeks. I remembered those words, the way they landed in my chest like stones. My planning grew patient. Patience was a tool. When Brant bragged about leaving a window unlocked, I took note. When Elise threw a plate and laughed, I cataloged the shards and the easy places a fire might catch. Each small secret became a step. One dawn, after a night of ice and breath that hung white in the air, the master announced a New Year's feast, full of promise for his fortune and his ego. That night he would gather his friends, show his daughter off, and drink the wine of his wealth while we served like phantoms. Elise, in a silk dress that made her sway like a queen, would be especially shown off. I would stand near, holding trays, pretending to be less than I was. In cracks between chores and obedience, the plan grew boldness. I began to mix knowledge with timing, who would be tipsy by midnight, who would carry keys to the pantry, where the dry wood sat stacked close to oil lamps. I practiced small motions in the dark, Pichettia's small practice of paring and lifting and moving. Revenge is an architect's work. It needs foundation and preparation. What I would do one night required every piece to fit. Then came an evening when Joseph, a boy barely old enough to remember his mother's laugh, was whipped for an accident. The blows were not corrective. They were a sermon meant to remind everyone of their place. I held my hand in my lap that night as if waiting, and all I could see were the faces of my people, hollow, tired, and beaten into submission. I knew then that quiet would not be enough. The ledger would be closed in a way they could feel in their bones. And when I began, even the church bells could not drown what followed. I learned that revolution is a small, careful thing long before it becomes thunder. The turning point for me was not immediate. It was a slow collection of moments that, when struck together, made a spark. Weeks before the act, I watched the master's patterns like a man learning a song. Brant slept in the barn some nights after too much drink. The master wrote letters and left his vest with the keys dangling on a peg over the fireplace. The pantry, which held spices and flour, and the hidden tin with the little skull mark, was left unlocked sometimes on Sundays when they thought themselves righteous at church. I began to keep my hands near these places, fingers brushing the grain of the wood, imagining the heat of a coming flame. I started small, a thrown ember in a pile of kindling, a spilled candle near a curtain, a mislaid rag by an oil lamp. Each small incident was a measure, and each test confirmed that more could be done. I learned how smoke crept along beams and how long it took for curtains to ignite. I memorized which windows stuck and which hinges were loose. A plan like that is its own prayer. The decision to use poison came from a darker place. I had found, in the pantry, a small tin of arsenic, a thing for rats. It sat quiet and ordinary, and yet it held the power to silence a man's supper without a scream. To kill a single master quietly would shift attention in one direction. To burn a house would be noise enough to hide other acts. I did not want senseless cruelty. I wanted calculation. If the overseer, Brand, who loved a fight and the smell of blood, was taken early that night, the household's reaction would be chaotic, and chaos would help conceal the plan's wider shape. The night I chose was not random. It was one of the great feast nights. New Year's again, when the house required the most servants and the master felt most secure in his own power. The wine would loosen tongues. The music would drown whispers. I moved like a shadow that evening, carrying platters, filling glasses, smiling in the right places. Elise laughed and toyed, as always. The master bragged with other men of property and profit. Brant clapped his hands, boasting of punishments he had meted out that week. At midnight, I slipped away under the noise. I carried the arsenic tucked in my sleeve and a small tinder bundle hidden under my shirt. I poured a pinch into the overseer's cup when he reached for a second glass. It dissolved there like a secret. Then, while the men argued in the parlor, I fed the tinder into a curtain seam and tucked a soaked rag near an oil lamp by the corridor where the drafts would catch. My hands moved with a calm I had not felt in years, a cold, surgical calm. The first sign was a small hiss of smoke, a smell no one expects until it is too late. Then came a scream from the kitchen. Someone had noticed a flame flick at the curtains. A man ran as others shouted. The household scrambled in a scene that had the rhythm of a storm. Brant staggered, his face twisting with something between horror and fury, and fell to the floor where he vomited and choked without clarity. The arsenic took him fast. He had always loved his spirits, and that helped the poison find him. Panic spread. Men shouted. Women cried. They banged doors, looked for wet blankets, spilled wine, and made slips. Elise woke under smoke and screamed a sound that made me feel the last of my restraint leave. Her operatic cry is something I have not been able to unhear. It cut across the night and made the servants scatter. In the confusion, I did not act with haste, but with the slow certainty of someone following a map. Doors unlatched accidentally in the rush. A curtain that had been soaked in oil touched a lamp and snapped like a dry bone. The fire began to travel. They say disasters have a mercy. They level out differences, both masters and servants scrambling for breath. But in that moment the differences sharpened. Men who had been drunk fell into decisive action. Women who had been soft found steel to their bones. I moved in the margins, helping where it looked honest and ensuring the plan's threads held. I closed shutters in some rooms but opened others, letting smoke travel where it would. When Brant's body slid between the chairs, when the overseer, who had broken so many men, fell like a log, I felt no triumph in his collapse, only the gravity of what had been set loose. The house was soon a creature of flame and sound, and I, who had been given to Elise like a toy, slipped from the hall into the dark beyond. By the time the master realized the depth of his loss, I was already several yards away, breath steaming in the cold air, the sound of the burning house behind me like a slow drum. What I had set in motion changed everything that night. Fire is both a voice and a tune. It speaks by swallowing and leaves memory to smoke. When the flames took the upper parlor, the chandelier fell and the master's books ignited like wings. The light from the fire painted faces with a strange, merciless gold. Elise ran, sand dragging and catching sparks, her hair loose and wild, her screams slicing the air. For a moment, the house looked unmade, as if the veneer of civilization had been peeled away. I watched her from a doorway, feeling the weight of every small cruelty she had needed to exist. The sight of her helpless made something complicated rise in me. Sympathy braided tightly with the steel of judgment. But above all, there was the sensation of a ledger being closed. Every insult, every ordered lash, every time she'd made someone smaller, registered like a debit in my memory that this night would finally square. Brant stumbled to his feet and tried to seize me in the first confusion, but his strength failed him. The arsenic had already done its quiet work, and the world was tilting under his feet. He lunged, missed, and fell into the stairs where a shard of wood caught him. He cried out once and then was still. In the chaos, men grabbed buckets, threw rugs, and tried to save what could be saved. Women wailed. Men cursed. The master tried to find the keys to the fireproof chest and discovered that, in his own panic, he had left them elsewhere. I moved toward Elise then, not as an executioner, but as something with more complicated motive. She looked at me with a face I had never seen before, terror and terrible recognition. Her breath came quick, eyes wide and clear. I had been her servant. I had been the one who laced her bodices and smoothed her skirts. I had been the one to fetch her water, to listen to her petty laments. Now the roles were stacked like splinters between us. She grabbed my arm in desperation. Her hand was slippery with sweat and ash. "Sammy," she said, the name like a blade. "Hold me. Get me out." Her voice was small and human and frail. In that moment, all the accumulated cruelty in me did something I had not expected. It hesitated. Instead of dragging her away like the masters had dragged us, I set her down on a chair and pushed a wet blanket over the back of it. I led her to a window that opened to the back walk. The house roared around us. Smoke filled the throat of the world. I thought of throwing her into the yard and letting the night decide, but the memory of my mother's voice stopped me. "We are not monsters." Outside, the slaves who had hidden watched from the trees beyond the yard, faces lit by the burn. Some leaned forward, some backed away. Their eyes met mine, accusation, hope, and a terrible question of what had been done and what would be done. The master's brood scrambled under the porch, clutching what they could salvage. The mistress prayed, and the neighbors screamed. The overseer's body lay like a testament between the fallen chairs. Men would later ask who had struck the final blow. The truth was a dozen small acts and the merciless algebra of poison. I could have killed more that night. I could have taken the master in his panic, could have left the house emptied of its owners. But the act I had chosen had been surgical and symbolic. The house burned, the overseer fell, and Elise left in the smoke to understand a fraction of what she'd cost others. What I did next was not the end, but the hinge on which everything turned. I walked away as the fire hungrily licked the roof, stepping through a field of ash and light. Behind me the world I had known, with its masters, its ordered cruelty, its measured punishments, collapsed into heat and sound. Ahead of me was a dark line of trees, and the unknown that waited beyond. My heart beat loud enough to drown the crackle. I had set in motion a change I could not fully control. The flames seared memory into every face present. I had struck the match, and the night kept its secret. Dawn after such a night is a poor thing, hazy, embarrassed, like it had overslept and found itself in a ruined house. When morning rolled in, the house looked like a carcass. The grand porch sagged. The curtains were skeletons of fabric. Silver lay black and warped. The master staggered from the house, eyes empty as a man who'd looked into the abyss and found his reflection. Elise, wrapped in a shawl, sat with her face streaked with tears and soot. People who had once laughed at our toil now stood mute, mouths open like fish, and there were questions in their faces like accusations they could not speak. Brant was gone, his body claimed by the night, and then by men who would whisper of poison and retribution. They searched for a culprit. They pointed fingers at servants, at outsiders, at spirits, wherever blame would keep them from looking inward. The law would be called in a few days, and men would be hanged for less. Rumors of buried bodies, of hanged men, of secret graves would ripple through neighboring plantations. For a while, every farmhouse and hamlet spoke of that night in a hush. For us, the enslaved, the night opened possibilities and dangers at once. Some used the confusion to escape into the woods. Others waited, hearts pounding, for the master to choose a scapegoat. We buried Isaac, who had died under Brant's cruelty months earlier, and sang a low song that seemed to stitch our hearts. Some of us who had helped in the plan went to the river and washed our hands as if we could wash away the shape of what had happened. We knew there would be consequences: hanged men, sold families, reprisals that would look like justice but smelled like revenge. Elise's body, the thing the title whispers about, became a different kind of story in the days after. She recovered slowly from fear, her weight unchanged, but her patience worn thin. She would walk through the remains with a new humility that frightened us more than her cruelty ever had, because humility could be learned as quickly as conceit. People speculated. Would she leave? Would she become softer? Or would she harden and become the kind of woman who would remember who had embarrassed her and find a way to wind vengeance like a thread? For me, the aftermath was a taking of inventory. I lost some friends to suspicion. Joseph's young face was last seen walking toward a distant county. Ruth's hands stopped sewing. Some were sold in panic when the master's creditors came. In the small cabin where I slept, the space felt different, hollowed out by what I had done. I had thought that when the ledger closed, freedom would open like a door. The truth was a shorter step and a longer road. I was no longer simply owned, but I was not free. I had become a marked man with a story that would be whispered and then told. People asked if I had regretted it. Regret is a complicated thing. I regretted the price others paid because of my choice, the men sold, the families scattered. I regretted the nights a child could not sleep because of fear. But I do not regret the ledger closing. Some acts are necessary because they balance a world too heavy with theft. We had been buried alive in chains of cotton and coin for so long that even burning a house felt like sunlight. Years passed, and tales grew. Some claimed I escaped north to freedom. Others swore I died in a swamp. Stories, like seeds, take root where they can. The plantation itself was sold off in pieces after the scandal. The Caldwell name lost its luster. People came through the charred remains and took souvenirs, as if ashes were relics. Children in nearby cabins grew up with the story on their lips. The night the house burned and the slave they called Sammy changed the course of their lives. When I think of the night now, I think not only of flames and revenge, but of the small things. The look in Elise's eyes when she realized she was not untouchable. The last sigh of Brant when his chest gave way. The quiet singing of the women when they carried water for the living. Memory keeps the sharp and the soft together. It ties the ledger's pages and asks us what we did with our arms and our voice. If there is one haunting line left with me, it is this: we were called names to make us small, but in the smallest hour, I learned how to be something else. I set a match to a house because the house kept us in cages. I took no joy in the suffering that followed. Pain is not a trophy, but I knew, in my bones, that some debts demand payment. And when the smoke cleared and the ashes cooled, the world had changed in a way that could not be fully undone. What I did that night left them speechless, and in that silence, something like a story began that would not be easily buried. They say the fire died by morning, but I don't believe that. Some nights, when the wind moves across that land, you can still hear the beams cracking, the horses screaming in their stalls, the echo of chains hissing in the heat. I walked those ashes weeks later, when no one was left to watch. The soil still smelled like fat and burnt oil. Every step sank into blackness, the kind that doesn't just stain your boots, but your soul. Elise's room had caved in. The roof split open above her canopy bed like a wound. Her mirror, the one she used to stare into for hours, had melted into a puddle of silver, her reflection swallowed by fire. I remember touching that warped glass. My face appeared there for a second, but it wasn't my face. It was something stretched and hollow, a reflection that blinked slower than me. I left it alone. Some mirrors don't forgive what they've seen. Rumors spread that Elise hadn't survived after all, that she died days later, coughing up soot and blood. Others swore they saw her walking along the riverbank in her burned dress, whispering my name. Sammy, they said she called, her voice dragging through the reeds like wind through a graveyard. I never turned to look. Some names, once spoken by the dead, are traps. I kept walking. For weeks, I lived in the forests along the backwater roads, feeding on roots and river fish. I told myself I'd made things right, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw her, not Elise as she'd been, cruel and pampered, but Elise on the floor, eyes wide, reaching out. The guilt crept slow, like ivy. It whispered that maybe, in destroying one evil, I had invited another. The world didn't seem freer, only quieter, emptier, colder. Once, while crossing the old fields where the cotton used to grow, I found the shape of chains buried in the soil. Not iron, not anymore, rusted away, half swallowed by dirt. I ran my hand over them and felt warmth, like they'd only just been used. Then, faintly, I heard it, the sound of breathing. Dozens of them, all around me. I froze. The air thickened. And when I looked up, the mist in the field had faces, black, gray, soft and fading, like the memory of people who had once bent their backs there. Their eyes followed me. They didn't speak, but they didn't have to. Every soul burned on that land, innocent or cruel, had stayed behind. The plantation had become a mouth that never stopped whispering. That night, I dreamt of the house again, but it was whole, not ruined. The lamps glowed. Music drifted down the hall. Brant laughed somewhere distant, and Elise sat by the piano, humming the same tune she used to mock the servants with. Only this time, every note was off-key, wrong. The walls dripped with tar, and when she turned to me, her skin was cracked like old wax. "You didn't free us," she said. "You just joined us." I woke up choking on smoke that wasn't there. Weeks later, a preacher found me outside a church in Natchez, filthy, half-starved, clutching the charred remains of my mother's locket, the one I dug out of the ashes before leaving. He offered me water and called me brother. But when I told him where I came from, his face drained of color. He said they'd sealed off that land, called it cursed. He said no crops would grow there, no birds would land. And at night, lights flickered across the field, like candles being carried by invisible hands. He prayed for me, but I didn't feel saved. For years, I tried to live quietly, working river docks, sleeping in barns, moving from one forgotten town to another. But I was never alone. Sometimes, in the stillness before dawn, I'd hear chains dragging across wood floors that weren't there. Once, I saw a figure in white standing at the end of a pier, hair matted, dress burned. I thought it was Elise. But when she turned, her face was every face I'd ever known on the plantation. The men, the women, the children, all of them, stitched into one body, watching me, waiting. I screamed until my throat went raw. The river didn't echo back. Now, I'm an old man, or maybe just a tired ghost wearing his skin too long. The fire took everything but left its sound inside me. I can still hear the whip cutting air, the overseer's last gasp, the way the piano strings snapped one by one as the flames ate them. I thought revenge would make me free. But freedom built on ashes is only another kind of prison. Sometimes, people come to that land still, travelers, storytellers, those hungry for haunted places. They say if you stand there long enough, you'll smell smoke. You'll hear chains moving under the ground. And if you whisper my name, Samuel, the wind will answer. Some swear they see a man standing in the ruins of the old porch, staring into the dark, waiting for the fire to start again. Maybe that's me. Maybe that's all that's left. The plantation still burns, though no one can see it. The fire eats and eats, and the night never ends. Every cry, every breath, every whip's crack plays again and again like an echo that refuses to die. And if you listen close enough, you'll hear her voice, Elise's voice, still calling from the house that isn't there. Sammy, the feast isn't over. The air trembles when she says it, and the chains answer.